At 0600 hours on August 17, 1944, Major Hans Ulrich von Luck stood in the command post of Kampfgruppe von Luck near the village of Truns in Normandy, France, listening to sounds that meant death was coming from above. The sound was distinctive, not the rumble of artillery or the crack of rifle fire. It was the whistle of diving aircraft followed by the rapid hammer of 50 caliber machine guns. The Americans called them Thunderbolts. The Germans had another name, Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. And when the Jabos came, men died. Von Luck was 33 years old, commander of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 125 of the 21st Panzer Division. He had fought in Poland, France, North Africa, and Russia before Normandy. Now his battle group was tasked with holding open the western end of the Falaise Pocket so that trapped German forces could escape. 50,000 German soldiers were surrounded on three sides, with only one narrow corridor that von Luck's men were fighting desperately to keep open. The Panther tanks and assault guns under von Luck's command were supposed to be among the best armored vehicles in the world. Sloped armor that could deflect most Allied shells. 75mm main guns that could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters. Superior optics. Excellent mobility. German tankers knew their Panthers and Tigers could win almost any ground engagement against American or British armor. But none of that mattered when the Jabos came. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a massive single-engine fighter aircraft, one of the heaviest fighters in the war. When fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and ordnance, it weighed 17,500 pounds, approximately 8 tons. The aircraft was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp radial engine, an 18-cylinder air-cooled power plant producing 2,000 horsepower. This massive engine drove a 4-bladed Curtiss electric constant-speed propeller 13 feet in diameter. The P-47's primary armament consisted of 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing outboard of the landing gear. Each gun was loaded with between 300 and 425 rounds, giving the aircraft a total ammunition load of approximately 3,400 rounds. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the Thunderbolt could put out a weight of fire exceeding 100 pounds per second. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate light armor, ignite fuel tanks, and shred soft, skinned vehicles. Beyond its machine guns, the P-47 could carry external ordnance on hardpoints under the fuselage and wings. A centerline rack could carry one 500-pound bomb or a 300-gallon drop tank for extended range missions. Wing racks could carry additional bombs, bringing the total bomb load to 2,500 pounds. Alternatively, the aircraft could be armed with 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, known as HVARs. These rockets used a 7.6-pound TNT general-purpose warhead and were effective against vehicles, buildings, and personnel. The Thunderbolt's most remarkable characteristic was its ability to absorb battle damage and continue flying. The radial engine, unlike liquid-cooled inline engines, could lose several cylinders to battle damage and continue operating. The airframe was constructed with heavy structural members and thick aluminum skin. Armor plating protected the pilot from the front and rear. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning that bullet holes would automatically seal themselves to prevent catastrophic fuel loss. P-47 pilots routinely returned to base with extensive battle damage. Aircraft came back with holes punched through wings, fuselage, and tail surfaces. Some returned with entire cylinders blown off the engine. Others landed with control surfaces partially shot away. The Thunderbolt earned a reputation among pilots as the aircraft most likely to bring them home alive after taking hits from enemy fire. But in August 1944, the P-47's greatest tactical advantage was not its durability or its firepower. It was the fact that the Americans had complete air supremacy over Normandy. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies. German tanks moved during daylight at their own risk. Allied fighter bombers ruled the sky, and the Germans were learning what it meant to be hunted from above. The tactical problem facing German armored forces in Normandy was unprecedented in modern warfare. Since June 6th, D-Day, Allied aircraft had attacked German formations with relentless intensity. British Typhoons, armed with 20mm cannons and rockets. American P-47s with their 50 caliber machine guns and bombs. P-38s with cannons and machine guns. The attacks came in waves throughout daylight hours, particularly during clear weather, turning roads into killing zones and forcing German units to move only at night or in heavy fog. Official Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early July 1944 documented that Allied fighter bombers were conducting between 2,000 and 3,000 sorties per day over the Normandy battlefield. German formations attempting to move to the front during daylight hours were losing 10 to 15% of their vehicles before reaching their designated assembly areas. Tank columns reported being attacked every 20 to 30 minutes when weather permitted flight operations. The operational impact was devastating. German armored divisions that should have been able to cover 50 to 80 kilometers per day were reduced to moving only at night, covering perhaps 20 kilometers before dawn, forced them back into concealment. Units dispersed into small groups and hid in woods or villages during daylight hours. Camouflage netting became more important than ammunition. Commanders planned movements around weather forecasts, praying for clouds and rain that would ground Allied aircraft. The psychological impact was worse than the physical damage. German soldiers throughout Normandy coined a term that captured their fear: Jabo Tod, death by fighter bomber. It became the most feared way to die in the campaign, not in tank versus tank combat where training and skill mattered, not in infantry assault where individual courage could make a difference, but helpless on a road, strafed repeatedly, unable to fight back effectively, watching comrades burn in vehicles that had become steel coffins. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, perhaps Germany's most respected armored warfare commander, understood this problem from the earliest days of the Normandy campaign. On June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, Rommel sent a frank assessment to his superiors at the Wehrmacht High Command. The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There's simply no answer to it. Every movement of our troops by day is subject to air attack from fighter bombers. The enemy has complete command of the air over the battle area up to about 100 kilometers behind the front. Rommel's assessment was not pessimism or defeatism. It was accurate tactical analysis from Germany's most experienced field commander. He had fought against Allied air power in North Africa. He knew what air superiority meant for ground operations, and he knew that without control of the air, German armored forces could not execute the kind of mobile warfare that had brought them victory in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. 2 months later, on July 17, 1944, Rommel himself became a casualty of Allied air supremacy. He was returning from an inspection tour of the front lines when his staff car was spotted by British Spitfires from 602 Squadron Royal Air Force. The Spitfires dived and strafed the vehicle on a road near Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. Machine gun fire struck the car and the road surface, causing the driver to lose control. The vehicle crashed. Rommel, who was not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown from the car onto the road surface. He suffered 3 skull fractures, a fractured left temple and cheekbone, and damage to his left eye. Rommel never returned to Normandy. He spent weeks recovering in a German hospital. In October 1944, after being implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, he was forced to commit suicide by taking cyanide. The official Nazi government announcement claimed he had died from his injuries. But Allied air power had effectively removed Germany's most capable field commander from the Normandy battlefield months before his death. Rommel was not the only German general officer killed or wounded by Allied aircraft during the Normandy campaign. Between June 6th and June 18th, 1944, 3 German division commanders died in air attacks, a casualty rate among senior leadership that was unprecedented in modern warfare. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, one of the most experienced defensive specialists in the Wehrmacht, was killed by a fighter-bomber attack on June 12, 1944, just 6 days into the campaign. He had been instrumental in organizing the initial German response to the invasion. General Heinz Helmich, commander of the 243rd Infantry Division, died in an air attack on June 17, 1944. His division had been attempting to move toward the front when Allied aircraft struck the column. General Rudolf Stegmann, commanding the 77th Infantry Division, was killed by strafing aircraft on June 18, 1944, as his unit attempted to reinforce defensive positions near the invasion beaches. These were not chance casualties from random encounters. They were the result of systematic Allied air operations designed to paralyze German command and control. Fighter bombers hunted for staff cars, command vehicles, and radio antennas that indicated headquarters locations. The psychological effect on surviving German commanders was profound. They knew that movement during daylight hours invited death from above, regardless of rank or position. Death at the hands of Allied fighter bombers had become so common among German forces that soldiers created their own grim terminology: Jabo Tod, death by Jabo. It was a fate that generals and privates shared equally. Rank provided no protection from 850 caliber machine guns firing from a diving Thunderbolt. Hans von Luck's 21st Panzer Division had been engaged in continuous combat operations since the first day of the invasion. The division held the unique distinction of being the only German panzer unit to reach the invasion beaches on June 6th, launching a counterattack against British forces advancing from Sword Beach toward Caen. Since that first day, the 21st Panzer had fought in every major defensive battle around Caen, suffering continuous attrition from both Allied ground forces and the unrelenting air attacks. The division had fought at Villers-Bocage, where Michael Whitman's Tiger tank had briefly halted a British armored column. It had defended against Operation Goodwood in July, the massive British armored offensive preceded by the heaviest aerial bombardment of the campaign. Von Luck's battle group had held critical positions on the Bourget-Bousse Ridge, using terrain and prepared defenses to blunt British attacks despite being heavily outnumbered. But even successful defensive battles took their toll. By early August 1944, the 21st Panzer Division had lost most of its original tanks and vehicles. What remained was an improvised mixture of surviving German equipment, captured French tanks and half-tracks, and field modifications created by the division's ingenious engineer, Major Alfred Becker. Becker had converted obsolete French armor into assault guns and armored personnel carriers, creating functional fighting vehicles from equipment that would otherwise have been useless. The division's soldiers called their collection of vehicles Rommel's Circus because of the motley assortment of German, French, and hybrid equipment. Some units operated Panther tanks alongside French Hotchkiss tanks mounting German guns. Infantry rode in a mixture of German half-tracks and converted French vehicles. The division's maintenance crews performed miracles, keeping this diverse fleet operational under combat conditions with limited spare parts. Von Luck's Kampfgruppe, his battle group, consisted of approximately 40 tanks and assault guns in mid-August, along with the 2 infantry battalions of his 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. These forces were operating as part of a desperate attempt to prevent the complete encirclement and destruction of German forces in Normandy. American forces under Lieutenant General George Patton had broken through German defenses at Avranches at the end of July and were racing east and north in a sweeping movement. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen. The trap was closing around 5 German divisions. Encirclement meant annihilation. German commanders knew they needed to withdraw immediately or face complete destruction, but Adolf Hitler had forbidden any retreat. Instead, he ordered an immediate counterattack, Operation Lüttich, an armored thrust toward Avranches designed to cut off Patton's supply lines and restore the German defensive front. The counterattack was launched on August 7, 1944. It failed catastrophically within 48 hours. The primary reason for the failure was not superior American tactics or overwhelming force. It was Allied air power. On August 8th, weather over Normandy cleared after several days of clouds and rain that had grounded most air operations. Allied commanders immediately launched every available aircraft. Over 3,000 sorties were flown that single day. P-47, Thunderbolts, and British Typhoons fell on German armored columns attempting to advance toward Avranches and later trying to withdraw from the failed attack. The attacks were coordinated through a sophisticated ground-air cooperation system. Forward air controllers with the advancing American ground forces radioed target coordinates to aircraft circling overhead. Fighter bombers dove on German positions, expended their ammunition and bombs, returned to forward airfields in Normandy to rearm and refuel, then returned to strike again. Some pilots flew 4 or 5 missions in a single day. The devastation was extraordinary. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite German armored formations, lost over 70% of its tanks and vehicles in a 48-hour period. The division effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Survivors described roads littered with burning vehicles, dead horses, and bodies. The division commander reported that his unit had been destroyed not by American ground forces, but by unrelenting air attacks that made movement impossible and concentration suicidal. The failed counterattack and subsequent airstrikes created the conditions for the Falaise Pocket, the encirclement that would destroy German combat power in Normandy. Canadian forces pushing south from Caen and American forces sweeping north from the Avranches breakout threatened to trap 5 German divisions in a shrinking pocket near the town of Falaise. German commanders recognized the danger and began a fighting withdrawal, attempting to escape eastward before the trap closed completely. But the withdrawal had to be conducted during daylight hours because the situation was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for nightfall. German units moved in daylight and paid a terrible price. This was the tactical situation that Hans von Luck faced on August 17, 1944. His Kampfgruppe had been assigned the critical mission of holding open the western end of the escape corridor near the villages of Troon and Chambois. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were trapped in the pocket. Half of them, perhaps 25,000, might escape if the corridor could be kept open for several more days. But keeping it open meant accepting continuous punishment from Allied fighter bombers. Von Luck's forces held defensive positions on low ridges west of Troon. Canadian and Polish units were attacking from the north, trying to close the gap. American forces were probing from the south, And overhead, throughout daylight hours, Allied aircraft circled like predatory birds, diving on anything that moved. The experience of being attacked by fighter bombers was described by von Luck and other German veterans as unlike any other combat they had experienced. Tank crews could see enemy armor at distance and maneuver to favorable firing positions. Infantry could dig foxholes and to create overhead cover against artillery. But fighter bombers gave almost no warning. The first indication was often the sound of diving engines, followed seconds later by the hammer of machine guns or the explosions of rockets and bombs. German anti-aircraft defenses in Normandy by August 1944 had been reduced to a few self-propelled guns and some improvised mounts on vehicles. These weapons had some deterrent effect, forcing Allied pilots to attack from higher altitudes or to approach from unexpected directions. But they could not prevent attacks. Allied pilots learned to identify anti-aircraft positions and strike them first, then attack the vehicles they were protecting. The psychological strain on German soldiers under constant air attack was severe. Men who had fought bravely in ground combat for years found themselves helpless against an enemy they could barely see and could not effectively engage. The sound of aircraft engines produced immediate anxiety. Clear weather, which soldiers normally welcomed, became a source of dread because it meant Allied aircraft would be operating. Some German units began moving only in very small groups, dispersing widely to reduce the effectiveness of air attacks. Others tried to move during twilight hours, the brief period after dawn or before dusk, when there was enough light to navigate but Allied air operations were reduced. But these tactics only slowed the inevitable. As long as Allied aircraft controlled the sky, German ground forces were vulnerable. On August 17th, von Luck's men held their positions through the day, fighting off probing attacks by Canadian forces while watching the sky nervously. The weather was clear. Allied aircraft were overhead almost continuously. German vehicles attempting to move through the corridor were attacked repeatedly. The road east from Troon toward Vimoutiers was littered with destroyed vehicles and dead soldiers. Von Luck later wrote in his memoir that the period from August 17th to August 21st, when the corridor finally closed, was among the most difficult of his military career. His men held their positions, allowing thousands of German soldiers to escape. But the cost was high. Many of his tanks and assault guns were destroyed by air attacks. Casualties among his infantry were severe. And the experience of those 5 days, under constant threat from above, demonstrated conclusively that armored forces without air cover could not survive on a modern battlefield. While German tank crews were learning this lesson in Normandy, the American pilots flying the P-47 Thunderbolts were gaining invaluable experience in close air support operations. One of these pilots was Second Lieutenant Quentin Annenson from Luverne, Minnesota, a small farming community near the South Dakota border. Annenson had been commissioned as a second lieutenant on January 7, 1944, after completing flight training. He arrived in England in May 1944 and was assigned to the 391st Fighter Squadron of the 366th Fighter Group, one of the 9th Air Force tactical fighter groups assigned to support the invasion of France. His first combat mission was flown on June 6, 1944, D-Day itself. He took off from Thruxton, England, flew his P-47 Thunderbolt across the English Channel, and dropped his bombs on German positions behind Pointe du Hoc in advance of the American forces landing on Omaha and Utah beaches. The mission was his introduction to combat and to the dangerous work of flying ground attack sorties against defended targets. 10 days later, on June 16th, Annenson's squadron relocated from England to a hastily constructed airfield in Normandy, operating from French soil while the campaign was still in its early stages. From this forward base, he and his squadron mates flew bombing and strafing missions almost daily, attacking German troops, vehicles, artillery positions, and supply dumps. On July 25, 1944, Annenson participated in Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive south of St. Lo. Over 3,000 Allied aircraft participated in the operation, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German defensive positions in a concentrated area. The bombardment was one of the heaviest airstrikes of the war, designed to shatter German defenses and create conditions for American armored forces to break through into open country. The operation succeeded, but at a cost. Some bombs fell short, killing American soldiers in forward positions. Annenson and other pilots witnessed the devastation caused by the bombardment and the desperate fighting as American ground forces exploited the breakthrough. On August 3, 1944, Annenson experienced firsthand the dangers of flying ground attack missions against defended targets. He was on a mission over Vire, France, attacking German artillery positions, when anti-aircraft fire struck his aircraft. Flak fragments punctured his engine and fuel tanks. His cockpit caught fire. Annenson tried to bail out, but the canopy had been jammed by the battle damage. He was trapped in the burning cockpit. Facing the certainty of burning to death, he made a desperate decision. He pushed his Thunderbolt into a steep dive, accelerating toward the ground at maximum speed. The rush of air through the damaged airframe, combined with the change in air pressure, extinguished the cockpit fire. Anundsen managed to control the badly damaged aircraft and landed at his forward airfield. The impact was severe. He suffered a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and burns to his hands and face. The Thunderbolt was a total wreck, broken in half from the crash landing. But Anundsen was alive. The P-47's rugged construction and the pilot's skill had saved him. After recovering from his injuries, Anundsen returned to flying combat missions. By the end of the war in May 1945, he had flown 75 combat missions over France, Belgium, and Germany. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight, the Air Medal with 9 oak leaf clusters for meritorious achievement during aerial flight, and the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. But Anundsen was not famous. Most Americans never heard of him during the war. His name did not appear in newspapers or popular books about aerial combat. He was one of thousands of fighter-bomber pilots who did the grinding, dangerous, unglamorous work of close air support without recognition or publicity. The work was as dangerous as any aerials. Combat. While high-altitude bomber escorts might encounter German fighters, ground attack pilots faced intense anti-aircraft fire on every mission. German flak units knew that Allied fighter bombers were their primary threat and concentrated their defenses accordingly. Pilots flew into a wall of explosive shells and machine gun fire every time they attacked a defended target. The psychological toll was severe. Unlike bomber crews, who flew at high altitude and might not see the results of their attacks clearly, fighter-bomber pilots saw exactly what their weapons did to enemy soldiers and vehicles. They saw men burning, trying to escape from destroyed vehicles. They saw the impact of their bombs and rockets on buildings and positions. The experience of repeatedly killing at close range, even enemy combatants who were legitimate military targets, affected many pilots profoundly. Anundsen later described the emotional and psychological impact of his combat experience. He struggled with nightmares and intrusive memories for years after the war. The images of men he had killed haunted him. He questioned whether the violence he had participated in was justified, even though intellectually he understood that defeating Nazi Germany required such actions. He struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why he had lived when so many of his friends and squadron mates had died. After the war ended, Anundsen returned to Minnesota, married Jacqueline Greer, the girl he had written letters to every day from England and France, and worked in the insurance industry for 40 years. He rarely spoke about his combat experience. Like many veterans, he found it difficult to explain what he had experienced to people who had not been in combat. The memories were painful. The emotions were complex. It was easier to remain silent. But in the early 1990s, nearly 50 years after the war, Anundsen's adult children convinced him to document his story. They wanted to understand what their father had experienced. They wanted to preserve his testimony for future generations. Anundsen agreed. He gathered his photographs, his letters, and his memories, and created a video documentary titled A Fighter Pilot's Story. The documentary combined Anundsen's personal photographs with archival footage from the National Archives and other sources. Anundsen provided narration, reading from his wartime letters and describing his experiences in his own words. The result was one of the most powerful and honest first-hand accounts of what American ground attack pilots experienced during World War II. The documentary aired on public television. In 1994, the 50th anniversary of D-Day, it received wide acclaim for its honesty and emotional power. Unlike many World War II documentaries that focused on heroism and victory, A Fighter Pilot's Story showed the costs of war, the psychological damage, the moral ambiguity, and the lasting trauma that many combat veterans carried for decades after the fighting ended. In 2007, documentary filmmaker Ken Burns featured Anundsen's story in his epic 7-part series, The War, which told the story of World War II through the experiences of ordinary Americans from 4 towns. Anundsen's testimony about his combat experiences, his relationship with his wife through letters, and his post-war struggles with trauma were central to the series. Millions of Americans heard his story through Burns' documentary. Anundsen died on March 5, 2008, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His documentary, A Fighter Pilot's Story, continued to be shown in schools, museums, and military training courses as an educational resource about the realities of aerial combat and the psychological costs of war. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat missions in Europe in May 1945, as German forces surrendered. By that time, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been built, more than any other American fighter aircraft. The aircraft had served in every theater where American forces fought, from Western Europe to Italy to the Pacific. Official Army Air Force statistical reports credited P-47 pilots with extraordinary achievements from D-Day through VE Day. The records showed 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives knocked out, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles claimed, and 68,000 trucks destroyed. These were the official claims submitted by pilots and verified through gun camera footage and mission reports. Post-war historical analysis suggested that these numbers were significantly inflated due to multiple factors. Pilots attacking the same target often each claimed it as destroyed. Gun camera footage in the chaos of low-altitude attacks was frequently unclear. Disabled vehicles were sometimes counted as destroyed when they might have been repairable. And pilots, like all combatants, tended to assess damage optimistically under stressful combat conditions. Modern historians estimate that actual destructions were perhaps 40 to 60% of the claimed totals. Even if the numbers are reduced by half, the impact on German logistics and mobility was devastating. Thousands of vehicles actually were destroyed. Hundreds of trains were wrecked. German units throughout France reported severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and supplies because Allied air attacks had destroyed so much of the transportation infrastructure. The fundamental lesson from the P-47's combat record in Normandy was about combined arms warfare and the dominance of air power in modern military operations. German armored forces, despite having superior tanks, superior training in armored tactics, and years of combat experience, could not operate effectively under enemy air supremacy. The tank had been the dominant weapon on European battlefields since the German Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940. Fast-moving armored columns, supported by close air support, had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, Greece, and penetrated deep into the Soviet Union. German tactical doctrine emphasized mobility, concentration of force, and exploitation of breakthrough opportunities. These tactics required the ability to move rapidly and to concentrate forces for decisive attacks. But in Normandy in 1944, Allied air supremacy made German mobile warfare impossible. Tanks could not move during daylight without inviting attack. Concentrations of forces attracted immediate airstrikes. Supply columns were destroyed faster than they could deliver fuel and ammunition to forward units. The entire German operational system, which depended on mobility and flexible response to changing tactical situations, was paralyzed by air power. This changed fundamentally how military theorists and planners thought about future wars. After 1945, every major military force in the world recognized that ground operations without air superiority were suicidal. Enormous resources were invested in developing anti-aircraft systems, from shoulder-fired missiles to sophisticated radar-guided surface to air missiles. Armies developed elaborate procedures for camouflage, concealment, dispersion, and movement techniques designed to reduce vulnerability to air attack. But the fundamental tactical reality remained unchanged into the 21st century. Control of the air means control of the battlefield. Ground forces operating without friendly air cover or effective air defenses faced destruction from above. The lesson that German tank crews learned in Normandy in 1944 has been relearned in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Ukraine. For German soldiers who fought in Normandy and survived, the lesson was learned at terrible cost. Hans von Luck was among the survivors. His Kampfgruppe held the escape corridor open until August 21st, when Canadian and Polish forces finally closed the gap near Chambois. Von Luck's unit withdrew eastward with the remnants of other German formations. He continued fighting through the retreat across France, the defense of the German border, and the final battles inside Germany itself. Von Luck survived the war, was captured by Soviet forces, and spent 5 years in Soviet captivity under harsh conditions. He was released and returned to Germany in 1950. He worked in business and agriculture in post-war West Germany. In 1989, 44 years after the war ended, he published his memoir, Panzer Commander, written with the assistance of American historian Stephen Badsey. The book became one of the most respected German memoirs of World War II. Unlike some German accounts that minimized Wehrmacht involvement in Nazi crimes or portrayed German soldiers as victims, von Luck's memoir was notably honest about German responsibility and the nature of the war Germany had waged. The book was valued by military historians and officers for its tactical insights and honest assessment of German operations. Von Luck devoted considerable portions of his memoir to discussing the impact of Allied air power on German operations in Normandy. He described in detail how the constant threat of air attack paralyzed movement, how German units learned to fear clear weather more than enemy ground forces, how the sound of aircraft engines became psychologically associated with helplessness and death. He argued that the decisive factor in the Normandy campaign was not the quality of German versus Allied equipment, not the relative skill of soldiers, not even the numerical superiority of Allied forces. The decisive factor was air superiority. Allied control of the air made it impossible for German forces to execute the mobile defensive operations that might have contained the invasion. German armor, which should have been able to counterattack rapidly and defeat Allied penetrations, was reduced to static defense and piecemeal commitment because movement attracted immediate airstrikes. Von Luck developed friendships with several of his former opponents after the war, including British officers he had fought against at Villers-Bocage and Goodwood. He participated in military history symposiums, gave lectures at military colleges in Germany and other NATO countries, and served as a consultant for historical documentaries about the Normandy campaign. He spoke frankly about German tactical mistakes, about the impact of Hitler's strategic decisions, and about the lessons that modern militaries should learn from the campaign. He emphasized repeatedly in these post-war discussions that armor without air cover is vulnerable to destruction from above. He used his own experiences in Normandy to illustrate how air superiority changes the fundamental dynamics of ground combat. And he argued that future military planners must understand that control of the air is the prerequisite for successful ground operations in modern warfare. Von Luck died on August 1st, 1997, at the age of 86. His memoir remained in print and continued to be studied by military officers and historians as a valuable first-hand account of Wehrmacht armored operations and the Normandy campaign from the German perspective. Both von Luck and Anensen, former enemies who never met during the war, contributed in their different ways to historical understanding of what the air war over Normandy meant to those who fought it. Von Luck provided the perspective of German armored forces operating under Allied air supremacy, describing the psychological and tactical impact from the receiving end. Anensen provided the perspective of American pilots conducting ground attack operations, describing both the effectiveness of close air support and the psychological costs of repeatedly attacking enemy forces at close range. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself became a symbol of American air power and industrial might during World War II. A few dozen examples survive today in museums and private collections around the world. Some are displayed as static exhibits, carefully restored to represent specific aircraft that flew in combat. A handful are maintained in flying condition, appearing at air shows to demonstrate the sight and sound of this historic aircraft. These surviving Thunderbolts serve as tangible reminders of what the aircraft accomplished during the war and of the pilots who flew them into combat day after day. They represent a period in aviation history when piston engine fighters reached their peak of development and effectiveness, and they embody the technical achievement of American industry, which designed, tested, and mass-produced over 15,000 examples of a complex, high-performance aircraft in less than 4 years. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt in Normandy is ultimately about the transformation of modern warfare that occurred during World War II. For centuries, battles had been decided primarily by soldiers and equipment on the ground. Naval power controlled the seas, but air power was a new dimension, less than 40 years old when World War II began, and its role in warfare was still being defined through trial and error. Normandy demonstrated conclusively that air power had become the dominant factor in modern military operations. Ground forces could still win tactical engagements through skill, courage, and superior equipment. But without control of the air, ground forces could not sustain operations or achieve strategic objectives. Armies that lost air superiority found themselves unable to move, unable to concentrate forces, unable to conduct the mobile operations that modern warfare required. German tank crews in Normandy learned this lesson the hard way. They had superior tanks in many respects. The Panther and Tiger had better armor protection and more powerful main guns than the Sherman. German tank crews had more training in armored tactics than their American opponents. Many German soldiers had years of combat experience from campaigns in Russia, North Africa, and Italy. By conventional measures of training, equipment, and experience, German armored forces in Normandy should have been able to contain the Allied invasion. But when Allied fighter bombers controlled the skies above Normandy, none of those advantages mattered. German armor could not move during daylight without inviting destruction. Units that attempted to move were attacked repeatedly until they stopped or were annihilated. The ability to maneuver, which is the essence of armored warfare, was taken away from German tank units by Allied air power. The term Jabo Tod, death by fighter bomber, captured perfectly the psychological impact of this new reality on German soldiers. It was death that came from above, death against which ground forces had limited means of defense, death that could strike at any moment when weather permitted flight operations. German soldiers throughout the Normandy campaign feared the Jabos more than they feared Allied tanks, more than they feared artillery, more than any other weapon or threat they faced. The sound of American radial engines became the sound of approaching death. The whistle of diving aircraft signaled the beginning of an attack. The hammer of 850 caliber machine guns meant rounds were impacting nearby, tearing through vehicles and bodies with equal ease. These sounds became psychologically associated with helplessness and fear. Even veteran soldiers who had fought bravely in ground combat for years found themselves terrified by the sound of diving Thunderbolts. That is the fundamental reason why German tank crews feared the P-47 Thunderbolt and the pilots who flew it. Not because the Thunderbolt was the most advanced fighter aircraft, though it was one of the best. Not because it carried the most powerful weapons, though its 8 machine guns and bomb load were formidable. Not even because of its legendary durability, though that characteristic saved many pilots' lives. German tank crews feared the Thunderbolt because it represented Allied air supremacy. When Thunderbolts appeared overhead, German forces knew they were exposed, vulnerable, unable to maneuver, unable to fight back effectively against an enemy attacking from above. The best they could do was take cover, disperse, and hope the attack would end quickly. There was no tactical solution, no clever defensive positioning, no superior equipment that could negate the threat from aircraft, attacking from above with virtual impunity. That psychological dominance, combined with the physical destruction caused by repeated attacks day after day, broke the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct mobile operations in France. German armor, which had conquered most of Europe between 1939 and 1942 through speed, flexibility, and concentration of force, was reduced to hiding in woods during daylight and moving only under cover of darkness. The hunter had become the hunted. The dominant weapon system of the early war years had been made obsolete by a newer technology operating in a different dimension. This transformation in the nature of warfare, more than any single battle or tactical innovation, determined the outcome of the Normandy campaign. Allied forces won, not just because they had more troops, though they did, not just because they had better logistics, though Allied supply systems were far superior to German capabilities. They won primarily because their aircraft controlled the sky over the battlefield, and that control made it impossible for German forces to maneuver effectively, to concentrate for counterattacks, or to sustain defensive operations over time. The P-47 Thunderbolt, flown by pilots like Quentin Annensen and thousands of others whose names are largely forgotten, played a crucial role in achieving that air dominance. The aircraft's rugged construction allowed it to survive intense anti-aircraft fire and bring pilots home even with severe battle damage. Its heavy armament of 850 caliber machine guns proved effective against ground targets ranging from vehicles to buildings to personnel. Its ability to carry bombs and rockets gave it versatility for attacking different types of targets. Its long range allowed it to operate deep behind enemy lines, interdicting supply routes, and attacking targets far from the front. Perhaps most importantly, the Thunderbolt was produced in enormous numbers. Over 15,000 were built. Hundreds operated over Normandy on any day with clear weather. That massive aircraft, operating continuously throughout daylight hours, meant that German forces could rarely move without being spotted and attacked. The psychological effect of knowing that enemy aircraft were always overhead, always watching, always ready to attack, was as devastating as the physical destruction the aircraft caused. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander-in-chief of German forces in the West, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment of the Normandy campaign in post-war interrogations. When asked what factors defeated German forces in France, he replied, 3 factors defeated us in the West, where I was in command. First, the unheard-of superiority of your air force, which made all movement daytime impossible. Second, the lack of motor fuel. And third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications, so that it was impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. This made impossible the bringing up of reserves, and it was foolish to attempt military operations in France under such conditions. Rundstedt's assessment, from one of Germany's most senior and experienced commanders, confirmed what Hans von Luck and thousands of other German soldiers had experienced firsthand. Allied air superiority, manifested through aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt, was the decisive factor that defeated German forces in Normandy. Everything else, the numerical superiority of Allied ground forces, the quality of Allied equipment, the skill of Allied commanders, built upon the foundation of air dominance. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the air campaign in Normandy extends far beyond World War II. The lessons learned in that campaign shaped military doctrine for decades. Every major military force in the world reorganized after 1945 to emphasize air power and combined arms operations. The United States Air Force became an independent service branch, separated from the Army, recognizing that air power was a distinct form of warfare, requiring specialized organization and doctrine. Other nations followed similar paths, building powerful air forces and developing equipment and tactics for both offensive and defensive air operations. The close air support techniques pioneered in Normandy became standard practice. forward air controllers, improved radio communications, better coordination between ground and air forces. These innovations from 1944 formed the basis for close air support operations in every subsequent conflict. The sight of aircraft attacking enemy ground forces, which German soldiers in Normandy experienced as devastating and unstoppable, became a routine expectation for Allied ground forces in later wars. The P-47 itself continued flying for years after World War II ended. Many aircraft were transferred to Allied nations' air forces. Some saw combat in later conflicts. Eventually, they were retired as jet aircraft replaced piston engine fighters, but their influence continued through the lessons they taught and the tactical approaches they validated. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.